I'm delighted to announce our next keynote speaker while you tuck into your dessert from what I will sure will prove to be quite a controversial yet insightful keynote. David Murrin, as a global forecaster, uses powerful insights from the practical forces of history to help businesses prepare for future turbulence. David first spoke about predicting geopolitical-based market forces at the Owen James Meeting of Minds way back in 2011, in which the audience were left inspired, albeit somewhat skeptical. However, over a decade later, all his predictions, including the rise of Obama and Trump, have proven true, and still to this day, the CEOs from the UK's largest wealth management and private banks talk about that speech. While I wish we were all gathering under different circumstances, we are very grateful to have David here with us again, to hear his views and guidance for what undoubtedly is going to be more difficult times to come. We will have time for Q&A at the end, but may I ask that if you do want to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll come over a microphone. It's just that obviously we have a virtual audience and they might not be able to hear your question. But without further ado, over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me at the back? We're all on? I always love this time of day because if you've had alcohol, I've got to keep you awake. So I'm really pleased it's just water on the table. It is a privilege to be back here 11 years later. I've called this the new age of war because I hate to break it to you, I don't think what's happening in Ukraine is a one-off event. And what I would like to do is share with you some insights as to the structures that got us to this moment and what you might expect going forwards. My background itself is I come from the world of principal asset management. I ran my own hedge fund for 25 years. And in 2013, I decided I was going to print money for longer than I wished to fight it, recognizing it was an end of empire phenomena, and that I would do something else until the time was right. In 2019, in the summer, I came to the conclusion that the time was right. And of course, I reached for restart my hedge fund. And then I had a realization, and that is when you manage money, essentially your obligation is to your investors, so you can't share your concepts. And the world I saw unfolding in front of us was quite simply a world of incredible, traumatic, challenging dynamics that brought into question the very existence of our Western society. And so I came to the conclusion that what was the point of earning lots of money if I couldn't help change it? So I created Global Forecaster. And Global Forecaster essentially is designed with a various range of products from forecasting to managing money to essentially how you manage your business through it, providing real-time appreciation of what's going on and strategies to survive it. And over 2 years, it's really grown. We were able to predict the pandemic on the 5th of January. How many of you were completely unaware of what was coming on the 5th of January? It was fairly obvious with the algorithms we use. And we were also able to predict the war in Ukraine months ago. Not just, I think it's going to happen, it is definitely going to happen. So I'm going to share some of the reasons why I was so certain and what comes next. But I'll leave you with one thought at the beginning. Up until now, money has been our currency. But I believe from now on, knowledge is our currency. Understanding how we got here, what we do next, how to navigate it, is the greatest premium in our society. And if you think about Ukrainians and what they've been through, all of them would die for the knowledge, literally, of what was coming next and how to navigate through it. And I think we have similar level events facing our financial system and our societies coming down the track. So back in 9/11, I remember watching it real time, doing all the right things from an investor perspective, but being really traumatized that what I'd seen wasn't just a random event. And I posed the question, essentially, was this an accident? Or was it a signal that the Western world and democracy that we thought would last 100 years in the end of history actually was in decline? It was a big question a week later. And I kept thinking, all this work I do is about price data and human behaviors. And there is no price data that goes back beyond 100 years. So what happens if this is linked to a 500-year cycle with no information? I'd have to construct another way of doing things. And I came up with this process here. It's called the 5 stages of empire, and it's underwritten all of my geopolitical predictions and constructs. And essentially, systems do 5 things. They're driven by demographics along the bottom curve. That's expansion to the peak and contraction thereafter. They go through regionalization. They have a regional civil war, just like Brexit. If you're interested, I was able to predict Brexit, not just that it was about to happen, but how it happened, why it happened, on the basis of a regional civil war that displaced linear thought processes with lateral thought processes. A social dynamic that releases huge creativity and in fact makes Britain the only system in the Western world in expansion. And already you can see the way it's taken the lead in terms of vaccine dynamics and also been the first to stand up for Ukraine. That's what I call national energy of expansion. It's still not optimized, it's still not the best it can be, but it's in existence and there's a lot to work with. Then systems expand massively, algorithmically, like China has over 20 years. When they get to the top of building their empire, they are a monopoly. So they pay back all the debt they needed to build it. They have a quiet civil war at the top, and that's where the lateral people who built the empire are displaced by the linear people because the instability of the system is such they can cope with it and they can assume control because it's a stable environment. And that reduction of lateral creativity and linear dominance actually makes the whole system uncompetitive, unadaptive, and presides over its decline. All the way through history, you can find this pattern. You can find it in companies, you can find it in their own life cycles, and you can find it in empires. And this is a system which literally explains why we are where we are. Because the next observation I made is there was something wrong when I came to the modern world. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, all these empires were much shorter than the averages I found in history. They were about 350 to 400 years. So of course I thought, hang on a second, it's got to be about technology. That's it, technology shortened the life cycle of a system. No, that wasn't it, because there weren't really technological differences down here. And then I realized, in fact, we are part of a super Western Christian empire. The meme that dominates the system is Christian religious beliefs. And the system at the bottom was the Catholic system. The Reformation was, in fact, the process whereby Protestants edged out Catholics, lateral versus linear, and became far more creative, assumed the role of maritime hegemony, and they built a whole empire. The peak of that empire was the First World War, second go up here, and 9/11 was literally the accelerating point of America, the last of the Western Christian empires. So it isn't just about American decline, it's about the decline of a super system linked to it, that it represents the last empire within it. It's the biggest power change in 500 years plus, right on our doorstep right now. So the question is, and I was here in 2011 when I predicted this, and I predicted it back in 2003, is the person that would fill the gap, the group that would fill the gap, the nation that would fill the gap, was China. And China would be literally algorithmic in its expansion. People looked at me even back in 2011 here, and so on. So let's look at the Asian system, because here's the big surprise. The Asian system isn't just young, didn't just start from nowhere. Just like there were nations within a super system, the Japanese was the first empire of the super Asian system of this cycle. We know what that was like. They started off in the in the late 1800s, 1900s. They had help from Western powers. They first went to war essentially with the Russians in 1904, second time, and actually dominated them. First idea an Asian system could beat a Western system that was thought to be genetically superior on all levels. And then, of course, they expanded so much they went to war and they lost their empire and they were subsumed into a westernized democracy. But back here in the Boxer Revolution, that was when China started its cycle. So you're talking about 120 years from the restart for China. And that's why it's in this hugely asymmetric, dynamic place that represents the filling of the vacuum as the Western system declines. And that amounts to this: 2 systems, one declining, one rising, and this shift in power. Now, you're all aware of that shift in power, and you see it economically. You might even define it as a dictatorship and an autocracy versus democracy. And it is essentially that structural difference. The systems of Asia are far more autocratic because there are more population dynamics. They're larger and they're used to hierarchical structures. The smaller structures of the West needed democracy, especially if they were seafaring, to optimize themselves. So this is truly a clash of civilization, individual value versus collectivism on an epic scale. And it sits right in the middle of our lives. This decade, right now, is a pinnacle moment. So how, you say to me, we deal with money and we've got to make money for investors. We need to understand when, and this is a lovely abstract idea. Great. So what do I do with it? I don't know. So now I'm going to give you the timing of why this decade right now is the hotspot. But before I do, I need to explain to you one other thing. So as an empire grows, and it tries to make itself, this is America, an empire, it borrows money. Because you've got to invest to become a monopoly after all. And then once you become a monopoly and a superpower after 1945, you pay back all your money, of course, because you can. But then what happens in decline is you start to become inefficient, less competitive. Your productivity decreases. So some smart linear thinker has a great idea, let's borrow some money. So this story started for America at the bottom of '03. It started actually in '01 when printing money became apparent for security reasons after 9/11. After all, there was a huge threat to the American construct. And I would argue America was 3 times leveraged at the bottom of '03. So then it met the next big problem, which was the '07 peak down to the bottom of '08, '09. And of course, same chap said, hey, why don't we get to 10 times leverage? That'll do the trick. Brilliant. So we all live in this illusion that America's back on stack. It's really doing well. Growth numbers look good on the outside. It's all okay. Great. Hurrah. And we have this huge beta trend. The biggest beta trend in history provided by the printing of money, where literally all the maverick thinkers who were lateral, could see peaks, could see problems, were swept aside by this printing of money that adapted our financial system to be beta following, without any maverick influences. And all societies have mixtures. But this is a really extreme moment where anyone who thought laterally didn't have a job, because literally, why do you fight the central bank? How many of you said or heard you can't fight the Fed? Okay, how about this way? Who hasn't said that? Okay, great. Everyone has. Because as we go to the peak of the cycle, essentially, you can't deal with the Fed. You can't fight them. I would say at the bottom 2020, America was 40 times leveraged. Just imagine that. That means when you see 4% growth, actually it's 0.1 real percent growth, leveraged 40 times. How many of you asked an economist and said, can you tell me what the real unleveraged growth of America is? If you do that, I promise you, every economist would go beetroot on you because they haven't even thought of it. They don't understand it. But if you run a fund and you're a leveraged fund, you know what leverage does to you. If it's going well, you look like a hero. When it reverses, you die very quickly. And essentially, that is America right now. Now, here's the next part of the story in terms of timing. Kondratiev was a Russian economist, and I have to say a visionary, around the time of the 30s. He even got to manage the Soviet economy for a time before Stalin disliked him and sent him to the Gulag. And he recognized that somewhere in this Western Christian system, there was a 56-year cycle in commodity prices. And every time there was a peak, there was a major war. So you can go from the Napoleonic Wars to the Civil War to World War I to Vietnam. And this is from my book, so it's 2009. And this is 2020 to 25, an Asian war, World War III. And I've lived with this for a long time. My study on top of finance is the study of conflict and wars. It's something I understand intricately and have studied almost pathologically, desperately trying to communicate the onset, because I had children and we have children. And the idea that we should blindly walk into another one because we wouldn't protect ourselves is an anathema. But we've done that. And now we're about to face the consequences on a number of levels. One of the reasons why these peaks happen is because actually you start to get rises in prices and it accelerates competition between the two hegemonic systems. So if you go to the Napoleonic Wars, it was 2 consumer societies seeking resources around the world, and the peak was here. The American Civil War, no one ever talks about the resource construct between the North and South of America. Go and read about it, because that was what triggered the onset of the real onset of kinetic killing. World War I, another case, a German system challenging British hegemonic power. Both systems were consumers, and of course the price of commodities soon went up to this level. Vietnam was very different. And in fact, I can model you a whole Cold War on one cycle. So in 1950, obviously the Soviets came out of World War II, and the Americans did. And as the price of commodities entered the peak of the cycle, lo and behold, it was really hard for a consumer society like America to compete with a commodity producing society, because a producing society has a hedge against inflation. And so by 75, not only was the West losing the wars in Asia, it was also losing the economic wars. And that meant the Russians could spend more money to project power overseas, and we were saturated by inflation and the dogma that our system didn't work. It really felt in 75, if you read the articles, that we were losing and wouldn't make it. But lo and behold, the peak of the commodity cycle rolled over. Someone asked the Saudis to go and sell more oil, but it was like pushing the barrels downhill. By 1990, the Cold War had ended because the Soviet Union was bankrupt as a commodity producer and the price of commodities had dropped. And conversely, the consumer society, with the help of Reagan's visionary policies, which really were again pushing a barrel downhill, was successful. Hence the end of history. The idea we'd never fight another war because we won forever. How asleep were we? This cycle is in more detail over here, and it's let me, as an investor, buy the lows in 2000, get out in 2010, understand this period here was literally downward cycle, recognize the low of oil, buying the low of oil at -8, and understanding that we are in this process here, the biggest inflationary cycle in 500 years. So when they tell you inflation is transitory, I promise you it's the biggest porky pie you've ever been told. What you should be asking next, most importantly, is how bad is it going to be? Because that's the thing I kept asking myself. Well, all I can tell you here is bad is very bad. And the best way to describe this to you is the last commodity cycle over here. This cycle basically is the Cold War cycle, and you can see CPI in America getting up to 15, US Treasury 10 years at 15%. Can you imagine that now? And then basically we come down into this 2000 trough down here, and something really bizarre happens. Instead of when the cycle restarts, as you see in oil over here, the black line, interest rates and inflation just remain flatlining. That's okay, man, because the Fed got it right, got it under control. That's brilliant. Forget about inflation, forget about those problems. Except for how do they do it? Well, the West did it by exporting all its manufacturing to China. Brilliant idea. Low-cost manufacturing, no inflationary issues, great. That's one of the main reasons why this remained flatlined. Cheap labor, somewhere else. And the Chinese had their own agenda. Now, if you think the Chinese may be a little cunning, if you think the Chinese may be a bit cunning, I need you to add 100 squared to it, because they duped us in the West. After the third Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996, when the Americans sent 2 carriers and a Mu group through, they realized they couldn't take on America overtly. So they went covert. And their plan was very simple. We will seduce the West into investing in our manufacturing base. We will make them think we will be like them if they do that. We will build the biggest manufacturing base in the world, and then we'll use it for an arms production facility to outproduce anything the West can do. That's what we've been funding, by the way, everyone. Our demise. And the process that we sit on now is that after 2020, they did something that I've only seen one other country do in the last decade. And that is, how many of you picked up that China moved from a model of manufacturing and export into a model of internally fueled consumer dynamics? Anyone recognize that? Brilliant. Do you know what that means? Do you know the last country that did it? Nazi Germany in 1936 after the Rhineland invasion. And they did it because they knew they were going to war. They did it and they knew they didn't want economic ties that could be cut off in the process. So when you see the reduced supply of goods from China, it's not just an intermittent process. It's an ongoing process, which is going to end with the bifurcation of the world. Because right now, the Chinese are supporting the Russians. They can't let the Russians lose, by the way. Because if they do, the implication being Russia becomes Western. They then have to defend their northern border. But the most important thing in a commodity cycle that's rushing through the roof here is essentially where do they get the resources from? Right now, Putin will sell them everything they need over land routes that cannot be interdicted by the US Navy. Geostrategically, that is a prize worth the world. So whatever you hear in the press, the Chinese are going to support Putin in whatever way they can. Now, they don't want a nuclear war. That's their threshold at the top. And that alarmed them because in a nuclear war, they get the same targeting from Russian and American missiles as anyone else does. I don't know whether you realize what mutually assured destruction is, but it means everyone goes together and no one gets to rise through the ashes, not just the two protagonists. And Xi realizes that. So he needs to make sure it doesn't go to a nuclear exchange. And the best way to do that is to keep Russia fueled. So every way you look at it, this is a Chinese supporting Russia dynamic. And it's exactly the kind of domino effect that takes place as you move into a global conflict. We cannot back out of this. It's an unwinnable situation in many ways, apart from accepting where we are and rising to it. And we'll come on to that in a minute. So how high and how bad is this going to get? Okay, so this over here was a commodity producer versus a commodity consumer. And this peak here is going to be two consumers battling out for whatever resources they can find. So let's just double it and put it up here. So somewhere around 30% for treasuries and CPI at 30%. But now we've got to somehow add back in all that money that was printed. It's about to fall on top of us. And we've also got to add back this dynamic of the return of our manufacturing base in a giant leap on our laps from China and having to set up the manufacturing to do it and the cost that goes with it and the supply chain disruption. So any way you look at it, the one thing I can assure you sitting here is your inflationary environment for your investors is gone through the roof. You're already managing a stagflation environment, but you're going to manage super stagflation within a year. So you need to be mindful about what you do to manage that. And none of us have lived through it because the last time was into 75 and we're all in diapers. So really you have to understand the logic of what inflation does. It destroys your assets in a way that is difficult to imagine. All of the things about sitting on things doesn't work, apart from if they're commodity producing organizations, items, or mechanisms. So if there's one place you need to think about, it's commodity related investment and gold and silver, because the financial dynamics that go with this process means that the fiat money of the West is going to be called into question. You're welcome to eat your dessert. I hope you've got some indigestion. Right, I know this is very hard to get your heads around, and it's a big thing, but this is the financial inflationary dynamic. So when Boris Johnson says we're going to crush the Russian economy, I can tell you that it is like taking a knife to a gunfight, because Russia is a commodity producer, just like the Cold War. It will sell all it needs to sell to China, and whoever else in India will take it. We are consumer societies, and we are susceptible to inflation. We cannot win that battle on a short term or a long term. So do not be duped that this process is going to be resolved through sanctions or economic war. We are going to lose that war. We need to confront it on a completely different level before it gets out of hand. And talking about out of hand, this is the story of Putin's war. So there are two ways that societies go to war. Commodity producers go to war if they have aggressive leadership or tendencies or expanding demographics simultaneously, which the latter is quite rare. So let's just say it's an individual's dream. They go to war essentially because they have money, and they take that money and they spend it on weapons. So the story of Putin is the story of this contractive cycle so far, as exemplified by oil. So he got in 2000, the beginning of the cycle, and this is the surge into 2008. And lo and behold, where was he making the Munich speech about the fact he didn't want to be part of NATO, didn't like what NATO had done? And I have to say, we did a shit job, right? That was our time to bring Russia into our fold, and the neoconservatives of America had their elbows out, and it didn't happen. And I do understand exactly what happened the other side of this coin. That was when he resolved himself to deal with it another way. And he was feeling pretty rich here, by the way, because dollar oil is very cheap in Russia, easy to get out the ground. So essentially, he basically restarted an armaments program in every space, If you think this is random, as someone that studies weapons, every space, he designed weapons programs that undermined American power. Hypersonic weapons that killed carriers, strategic ICBMs that could always penetrate, poisoned drones that could travel 10,000 kilometers into New York Harbor and blow up with a 2-megaton bomb. And then he built a large conventional army and he rebuilt his air force. So he had a plan all the way along. He had a little shock here, by the way, when the price of oil dropped. I'm sure he didn't really wake up very well, but pretty soon, this belt of high prices did all he needed to put it into his coffers. And this is called A, B, and C in the cycles. And I knew that this cycle here was one where the price would keep going down, the kleptocracy's higher inefficiency would hurt, and Putin was most vulnerable at this part. I wrote an awful lot about the need to bring him into the fold, to do that trade and do that bargain when he felt weakest at that moment. Of course, no one was interested because they didn't understand his agenda and didn't think we could ever be threatened. But that was the moment. The last possible moment was the bottom of 2020 in March. And then something happened. When it didn't happen there, the next prediction I was able to make was social unrest. Because now he'd impoverished his people, there were many people coming from in different ways, and I knew there would be some process of unrest here that he may or may not survive. Now, when you look at the Navalny process, it was backed by Western intelligence. It had to be. We were desperate to get rid of him, and it failed. Probably added fire to his vitriol at the same time. And from that moment onwards, as the price increased, his boldness increased, and essentially, inevitably, what was going on in Ukraine increased. And I gave an awful lot of reasons as to why it was going to happen and how it was going to happen, and even the mechanisms he would use in Ukraine to fight it. And now we have a situation in Ukraine where something horrendous is happening on our doorstep. Whether you've missed it or not, it is very important. It's mutually assured destruction was the design that kept us alive in the Cold War. And Putin making the threats he did are specifically designed to break down that construct. It started with the use of chemical weapons in Syria, which we didn't know anything about. It started with the use of Novichok in Salisbury, which we didn't know anything about. He split the constructs of mutually assured destruction and 3 weapons of mass destruction such that the uncertainty of Western politicians enabled a policy called, do you know what it is? De-escalation. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? I'm going to de-escalate my conventional conflict, which has failed, by dropping a nuclear weapon on your head. Because then you'll stop, won't you? And that de-escalates it. That's the model he's using right now. And it's firmly entrenched in his head. That's where the threats came from. And in the West, we've backed away from that, and we've allowed this process to happen in Ukraine without proper intervention. And I'm really sorry to say, until we confront that, which will take us to a Cuba moment, none of us are safe. Because the idea we can be blackmailed by nuclear weapons is well and truly on our doorstep. The idea that we can literally not respond with strength, which we seem to be ingrained upon, we can't confront it. Until we do, the world is not a safe place. It's a highly inflationary place, it's a highly competitive place, and we're stuck with an axis between Russia and China, which between them are the perfect marriage, and we're not properly mobilized. So I see this as the beginning of a process of conflict, and we have an option. Our option is either to spend more money on defense, and I mean a lot more money in emergency programs and recognize the threat, or literally we can carry on sleepwalking into a situation that will get worse and worse and worse, in a situation where China is accelerated into conflict because of the price of commodities. It has to go, because even it can't literally maintain its economy with this inflationary drag. So in a strange way, it's like a domino effect. The Russian dynamic, the invasion, the acceleration of the commodity price, which would have happened anyway, but it's really quite vicious. I think it's going to carry right up to $200 in oil. We haven't seen the end of it. Essentially, it's a sequence of events that financially we have difficulty with and geopolitically we have difficulty with. And when it comes down to stock markets, I was able, with my work, to predict the high in the NASDAQ when it got to 1,500 or 15,000. I would call the high at 57.20. The high was 57.40. And I think this is the collapse of what I call the doomsday bubble, the biggest bubble in history created by the printing of money. So if you think the Fed's going to save you with an inflationary outlook like this, it just can't. And really, this is a time for a completely different mindset. It's a time of basically understanding inflation, where the commodity dynamics will save you, and where all the other strategies that you've lived with, I think, are defunct. And it's a question of how quickly you can adapt to that. Now you get to ask questions. Please.
Thank you very much. Yes. Just a quick question about the Russian Federation and the scenario that you're painting. If Russia turns into Yugoslavia, when we see this sort of federated states breaking away, surely from a Western perspective, that keeps them occupied internally rather than actually looking at us.
Okay, so let's just talk about Russia right now. So the good Russians who don't want to live under a completely dominant state behavior left, as the good Germans did. Jews and the Germans left at the same time. And what's left is Putin's control over the media of a society that's always been hierarchical, always accepted the word of an emperor or one person, and the over 40s who are completely conditioned to be orientated towards that propaganda process. And right now he's enacted, there are two types of what I call polarization. One is Chinese, which I'm expansive and I want more and I want living space and Leibnizian if you're Hitler or I want to control the world. And the system naturally has that and leaders channel it. If you're in decline, like Russia, actually you have none of that energy. So you'll notice that the energy that Putin's tried to create is we're defending ourselves against an attack because that's the only way you have any chance of creating secondary polarization. So he is doing that right now. And at the moment, I don't think he's as vulnerable as everyone else would like to think. He's got control of his system. The more he tells that story, the more it'll be reinforced. And the more resources he'll pull in. And one of the things that I think we should ask a question about is why is only 20% of the Soviet Air Force being deployed if he's so desperate? He can't be desperate. He hasn't used his helicopter capability. It's all sitting there waiting. So the question is, he's not desperate, and what's he waiting for? And also be aware of the fact that she was aware of the date of the invasion. So they had obviously discussed it from the pre-Olympic meeting beforehand. So this is not a surprise to the Chinese. They encouraged it, would have stopped it. They're in it together, and I'm afraid there's more of this to unfold. And at the moment, we're behind a 15-year plan for both countries, and we think we're ahead because we got ourselves together, but our actions are actually behind the curve, in my opinion. So I don't see an unfederated Russia just yet.
Very, very interesting, insightful. Thank you very much. Two questions. One is, can nuclear power, specifically fusion, can that save us, especially from an energy cost perspective?
Look, as a physicist, the dream of fusion is an amazing dream. It's not technologically there for 10 years, so it won't help us before the peak I showed you. What could help us is thorium reactors. And I really think mini thorium reactors made mass-produced. So you can, you have no byproducts, so you can give them to emerging market countries. And B, the easier and smaller they are, the more they become nodal on your grid. So if there's one place to invest in, it's thorium reactors. And Rolls-Royce do them. And there's another company which basically are making small thorium reactors for ships. I think they are really the place to be if you're looking for that investment and the hope that they'll work.
And then the second is, you mentioned gold. Do you have any views on let's say, a digital format of gold?
Do I have any views about digital currencies, first of all? So digital currencies, I think, are a phenomena as a hegemonic currency moves into its final phase of collapse. It's the what do I do next in the vacuum? If any of you follow quantum computers, there are 15 of them in the world. The problem is how you program them, and they'll crack a blockchain like a nut. So I don't think that's a long-term solution at all. It's an interim solution. If you want to trade, your cryptocurrencies, you are trading a beautifully pure spectacle medium, but do not think of it as a safe haven or an asset class. It is nothing like that, in my opinion.
Thank you. If we think of the Cold War, one of the dynamics we had in place was that the Soviet Union initially was autark, so it had its own resource base, its own consumption patterns, and minimal trade and capital links with the external. After the 60s and 70s, it started borrowing from the West, and that was part of the downfall. Was it had a debt burden that it accumulated by the late 80s. The dynamic with China is the inverse. They're obviously the net creditor. They have trillions of assets. Much of that is basically papers, IOUs from all of us. In return, we have manufactured goods. How do you disentangle that type of economic relationship in your model? Because obviously, they would first have to detach themselves from this dependency, this interdependency that they themselves have created that's allowed their rise, that has to come first before you have the conflict, because otherwise there's huge mutual wealth destruction. It's basically an economic mutually assured destruction. So how does that work in
Are there any
nuclear?
Russian oligarchs in the room who could answer that right now? In answer to that question, it's going to be very sudden. It's going to be like a chopper that comes down. And anything that's stuck on one side, you lose your fingers, and the other stays. So if you're a Chinese investor in the West, you'll lose your money. If you're a Western investor in China, you'll lose your money. It will be that rapid, because this is not driven by a piece of political policy. We're moving towards a stage of a global conflict between a Western and autocratic bloc. And as we found out in Russia, the speed at which those changes take place can be really shocking. And I think that's where we're very close to. And yes, it'll be huge disruption. I mean, look at Boris. His biggest problem is, what do I do with the hole left by the oligarchs who don't invest anymore? I think the reason he went to Saudi Arabia wasn't just for oil, it was to find alternative sources of investment. And my answer to that is, you lower taxes and you make yourself a highly motivated destination for all other investment from the West. That's the option open to Britain. But I agree with you, the chaos that comes with it is going to be huge, but it's inevitable where it's going. And I'll give you an example of why I believe that the conflict dynamics will break the economic dynamics. If you read Churchill's accounts prior to the First World War, he said no one believed First World War could ever happen because of the complex entwinement between Germany and the rest of Europe. Didn't stop it. So you won't invite me to your children's birthday party then?
So just going back to your point about the mutually assured destruction and our inability or our desire to de-escalate, what should we do then? If you're the president of the United States or the leaders in NATO, what's your alternative tactic?
It's a really good question. So can I ask anyone in this room, have you been physically bullied in your lives? Okay, right. For those of you that have been physically bullied and understand that visceral response, a bully operates by inducing a state of fear or threat that inhibits your actions. It's like a dam you have to climb up the wall of and get to the other side. And even if you're courageous, you still have a deep breath to do it. That's exactly the construct that Putin's created. He's created Pavlov's dogs all the way through our leadership. And as someone that really identifies against the energy of bullying and how it operates, if it had been my choice, I would have called him up and said, Mr. Putin, would you just affirm to me you made a nuclear threat? And of course, there'll be some Russian words. And I would have said, you do understand that our signals intelligence is so accurate that we know where every part of your force disposition is outside the Ukraine before you invade and inside Russia, which means I know where you are every minute of the day. I know where your children are. So I promise you, the one that we send back is over your head and your children, because that makes it personal. And he is personal towards us. He picks on people like Truss. He takes Macron and takes him aside and turns him into the Putin whisperer and humiliates him. This guy is really clever at personal interactions and manipulations. So he only respects that commitment to force. And that's what I would have done. And I would have called his bluff, because I don't think he was mad. I've studied him for 15 years. I think he learned from Trump. And the thing about Trump was we all thought, oh God, he's going to press a button, he's only going to the toilet. And that is brilliant, because that creates such uncertainty that you think he's mad. And if you look at that clip when he first did it, you thought, oh, he's a bit mad. Nothing mad about the man. Look at all the other clips. He used that energy in the Trump persona to create more uncertainty. And of course, our press goes, he's mad. What do you do with a mad person with a nuclear button? And we back away and we create the very, very same Pavlov dog situation. I don't think he's going for Eastern Ukraine. If you go back and you look at his plans, it was always the whole of Ukraine. And I think after the whole of Ukraine, it's somewhere in the north, because it's a bigger plan than just a region. He's got himself very bogged down, really in trouble, and he's really got to stretch himself. But the Russians are some of the toughest people on earth. If you imagine a European country in Central Europe going through what Ukraine was, everyone would have gone home and put their white flags up. But Russians are as tough as the Ukrainians. It's just it's their homeland. So I think we really do have to show force and intention and nothing less than investment in defense on an epic scale to show Putin that we're serious, and also to show Xi that if he's going to do it, the barrier for him to jump is much, much higher, which gives us time.
Do you think we have enough lateral thinkers in our leadership and business to get out of this?
It's a great question. Great question. So in the case of Europe and America, no. Right? Europe is a wasteland of lateral thinking. And interestingly enough, if you look at the last 9 presidents, you will find 5 of them are left-handed, which means they're left-eyed and natural. 2 of them are ambidextrous, which means they fit in the bill. And there have only been 2 linear thinkers in US presidency. One was Carter, and that was hugely successful, wasn't it? And the other is Biden. Everything Biden does is the most incredibly predictable action. I think the reason why we're here now on top of the cycles I showed you was the moment that Biden did the elective route from Afghanistan. And I say elective because for $2.5 billion, he could have stayed there and just put the failed Cold War, or the pilot war as they call it, on ice. But he made it, crystallized it in the open, like a loss on your portfolio. And from that moment onwards, we were just waiting because Xi and Putin sat there thinking, oh my God, I've got to get going before he dies in office. He's my perfect enemy. And it's a really good example of how weakness begats aggression. Now, in Britain, it's different. So we went through, and I'll leave you with some really good news. The reason why... Okay, this conversation has explained to you how I see our reality now. What I'm saying is that once you accept that reality, you adapt with the strategies that actually let you win it and navigate through it. The problem right now is most people don't realize where we are, so we're kind of curve all the time. So I don't view myself as being pessimistic in telling you how I see the world. I want to be realistic so you can have realistic solutions and win out. And I believe that's still possible, but you need a giant wake-up kick in the butt. Now, in Britain, we had a civil war without bloodshed, which is brilliant. First civil war of regionalization I know of in history. Democracy contained this incredible energy. But what happened was we ended up with lateral leaders who were ill-disciplined, and we ended up with a linear set of government that weren't displaced. So in Britain, we've got lateral at the top, and not the best form of lateral, I might add. And then we've got linear still fighting that civil war at the bottom, and the combination is death to us because we just can't get ahead of the curve. I think Britain is closer to being able to do that than anywhere in Europe. And I argued that Brexit wasn't just about leaving the Titanic. It was about creating the one affirmed democracy in a weakened system of the West that could stand up and hold on to the Zimmer frame that was America and point it in the right direction. And if you look at what's happened over Ukraine, Britain has done exactly that. It has led the charge in terms of our end laws save the day. 2,000 shoulder-fired weapons, state-of-the-art, which are awesome, made the initial difference to give the Ukrainians confidence to keep fighting. We did that. Also makes us #1 target for Putin, which is why we have increased our defense expenditure is beyond me and irresponsible. Because we made ourselves a target and we say it isn't war, but if you're Putin and your generals are being picked off with a signals intelligence plane flown by the RAF on the Polish border, passing the instructions to the Ukrainians to drop a bomb on the exact location, he can't differentiate no war with that concept. So we need to wake up to the fact we are fighting a war and we're a threat and we're a risk. In terms of the markets, I really think you're in on the onset of the biggest bear market in history. There's no upside from this point onwards. And there's nothing that can be done with inflation creeping up that the Fed can do to reinflate the bubble. So man your lifeboats.
What are your assets?
Gold, silver, specific commodities, and some very neat shorts set at 66, 0.5% from the high in the NASDAQ. Yes, absolutely. Okay, I'm glad you asked that, right? Okay, the good news is this. According to the world of David, we've entered the risk of World War III and the contagion that goes with it. If we were definitive in the action against Putin and supporting Ukraine, it pushes the threat from Xi much further back, because they're not quite ready to go on their own. They will do, but they're not quite. and gives us time to do what we did in 1937 and 38, which is build our forces, build our defenses, to literally be able to survive it. So we are buying time right now by doing the right thing. If we do nothing, we have no time. If we do something, we have a chance of creating deterrence. And I do think that this is the decade. I call this decade catastrophe or consciousness. And I say it not just from an investor, but from a human being that recognizes there's some patterns in mankind's cycles that really need to change. And if you go to my website, a lot of these theories are available on the front, and a lot of more information is there. But it's called the anti-entropy of humanity. And it's this idea that our survival strategy is to literally create social constructs which order the world around us and push back the entry of the universe, which lets us live longer. And the penultimate process of that is right now we're looking at anti-aging mechanisms, looking after ourselves through medicine. And these empires are these humps, in effect. But when a hump gets old and sequestered, like the cell in your body, when a new system rises, we use warfare to displace the weak with the strong and make a new peak. So whether we like it or not, war has been intrinsic to our evolution and survival. We all abhor it. It keeps happening. Why? For that reason. In this case, new systems like China are trying to edge over old systems like the West. So we need to understand how war works. And we haven't regressed. We're just the same as we've always been. And through those recognitions, I hope we can step back from the brink. Because this one, I don't think we're going to survive with our weapons. So we need to understand how to do that. And there is a simple way of doing it. You deter your aggressors through full spectrum deterrence. You stand toe-to-toe with them so they realize they're at threat. And that's the only way you bring peace. And I think that is our avenue through this.
Well, that was really good news to finish on that last bit. I think we all put our hands together for a fantastic speech. Thank you so much. I wish I still had that bottle of Guinness underneath here, because I think I could do with it right now. Before we all run off to our bunkers, we do have one more session left. So if I could ask you to all make your way to your next session, and afterwards there will be one more session in here, and there will be lots of champagne afterwards, because I think we probably all need a glass. So thank you very much, David.